The heart of the mountain, the prize of Erebor, the Arkenstone. What was it? Where did it come from? And what became of it? And could it have been one of the lost Silmarils, as some believe? Hello friends, it's Scar here, and today we'll be discussing the Arkenstone of the Lonely Mountain. In the year 1980 of the Third Age, Khazad-dûm, the great realm of the dwarfs, fell, as the Balrog had been awakened, and the dwarfs had no choice but to abandon their homeland. They were led by Durin's heir, Thrain I, who led the survivors to find a new home. It took them almost 20 years till they established two new dwarven realms. There was the Kingdom under the mountain, Erebor, located in the Lonely Mountain, which was founded by Thrain I. And there was the Exiled Kingdom in the Grey Mountains, which was established by Thrain's son, Thorin I. Just to be clear, this Thrain and Thorin that I mentioned are not those talked about in The Hobbit. As the dwarfs of Erebor started to explore the Lonely Mountain and establish their mines there, they came across a gem of incredible beauty, the Arkenstone. Even in its unworked state, the dwarfs thought it was a gem like no other. They assigned their best craftsmen to work the stone into a multifaceted jewel. The Arkenstone was said to emit its own pale light, and after the dwarfs had cut and fashioned it, it changed all the light that fell upon it into 10,000 sparks of white radiance with glints of the rainbow. This gem then became a symbol of the line of Durin. In the year 2289 of the Third Age, King Thrain passed away, and his son, Thorin, took the Arkenstone and led what remained of the dwarven people out of Erebor to join the kingdom he had established in the Grey Mountains, because the majority of Durin's folk had gathered there. This kingdom prospered and grew wealthy, and they had 300 years of peace as their strength and numbers grew, though this couldn't last forever. For in the year 2570 of the Third Age, the dwarfs of the Grey Mountain were attacked by the cold drakes of Forodwite, which started the War of the Dwarfs and Dragons. The dwarfs managed to hold them off for 20 years, though they were eventually overwhelmed, their halls sacked and plundered, and what remained of their forces fled the Grey Mountains. They were now being led by Tror, Thorin Oakenshield's grandfather, and the great-great-great-grandson of Thorin I. Tror led his people to the abandoned halls of Erebor, and they slowly filled it with light and wealth, and there once again was a king under the mountain. And yet fate was cruel, for less than 200 years later, a dragon once again would be the bane of Durin's folk. This time it was in the form of Smaug, the greatest dragon of the Third Age. Once again the dwarfs were powerless to stop it, and they abandoned Erebor, and the mountains of gold, treasures, and even the Arkenstone were buried in the treasure hoard beneath Smaug the Golden. The next section covers the relevant parts in The Hobbit, so if you're familiar with it, you might want to skip a bit forward, but I'd like to include it for completion's sake. In the year 2941 of the Third Age, Thorin Oakenshield, Durin's heir, set out with a company of dwarfs, Gandalf and the Hobbit Bilbo to reclaim the lost kingdom of Erebor. They succeed, and Smaug is slain by Bard the Bowman, an archer from Lake Town, after Smaug attacks their town since they had helped the dwarfs. Bilbo then finds the Arkenstone and pockets it, though he doesn't tell Thorin about it. And later, the men of Lake Town and the elves of Mirkwood attempt to enter Erebor, hoping to use some of the gold to fund the repairs and rebuilding needed. Their negotiations with Thorin fail, and Bilbo later escapes to offer the Arkenstone to Thranduil, the king of the elves of Mirkwood, and to Bard, so they can use it as a bargaining chip with Thorin. Despite attempting to do this, Thorin delays the negotiations, for he hopes that he could reclaim the Arkenstone through force, as he had sent for some dwarven reinforcements led by Dane Ironfoot. The dwarves arrive, and as soon as they're about to fight against the forces of men and elves, Gandalf interrupts them and informs them that an army of goblins and wargs were approaching them. What follows is the Battle of the Five Armies, and during this battle, Thorin Oakenshield is slain. As an act of respect, the Arkenstone is buried upon his breast, deep within the lonely mountain. And now for the interesting part. What was the Arkenstone? Could it actually have been one of the Silmarils? So first, let's look at their similarities to establish why this theory exists in the first place. So the three Silmarils were created by Fëanor, the greatest elfsmith that ever lived, and these gems were infused with the light of the two trees of Valinor. This is why they shone with their own light. Now these are lost eventually, one in the sea, one in the air, and the last one was thrown into a fiery pit. Now some believe that this last Silmaril could have eventually made its way to the lonely mountain via magma currents beneath the earth. We're also told that two of the three Silmarils would remain lost until the end of Arda. So could this be suggesting that the third Silmaril would be found eventually? Finally, the last reason behind this theory is the effect that the Silmarils and the Arkenstone have on people, both being so beautiful and captivating that they could even sow discord amongst allies. So these are all strong arguments that could be made in favor of this theory, and yet they have many flaws. So let's tackle them in a stepwise manner. So both the Silmarils and the Arkenstone could emit their own light, sure, but the Arkenstone gave off a pale light, while the Silmarils were piercingly bright. What made the Silmarils special wasn't their power to emit light, but the fact that in them they had the essence of the two trees of Valinor, and it was this essence that gave them this inert, bright light. The Silmarils were made from a material called Silimma, which is believed to have the property of emitting its own light, and only Fëanor knew how to make it. Now we know that Fëanor had at first experimented with other gems before the Silmarils. As we're told, the first gems that Fëanor made were white and colourless, but being set under starlight, they would blaze with blue and silver fires. Could it be that perhaps these gems were also made from Silimma, and thus could capture and emit their own light also? Some of these gems were located in Fëanor's treasury, but they were stolen and eventually consumed by Ungoliant. Could it be that some of them made their way to Middle-earth, and that perhaps the Arkenstone was made of a similar material? It could even be one of the lost lesser gems that were initially made by Fëanor. So the next part was that of the fiery pit and magma currents, that they might have moved the Silmaril towards the lonely mountain. And in the real world, this could be possible. However, in the context of the story, it's highly unlikely. The pit in which the Silmaril was thrown into wasn't some vast hole that reached the center of the earth. Instead, it was a pit that was formed during the War of Rat, one of the greatest battles in Middle-earth's history, which ended with the defeat of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. Now there's still the statement that two of the three Silmarils would be lost until the end of the world. However, the third Silmaril that isn't lost isn't the one that was thrown in the pit. On the other hand, I believe it's referring to the one that was said to be in the sky. This Silmaril was taken by Erendil and placed upon his brow, and it would become the Star of Erendil that could be seen in the night sky as he sails across in his flying ship. Thus, this one is accounted for and its location is known, while the other two are still lost. Regarding the effect the Silmarils and the Arkenstone had on people, I think it comes down to all of them being incredibly beautiful gems, so beautiful that they would awaken the greed in others. There are more arguments to be made against this theory. So the first one is that the Silmarils could not be broken, scratched, or marred in any way, while we're told that the Arkenstone was cut and etched by the dwarves. However, for this argument, some believe that, perhaps with time, some sort of crystal grew around the Silmaril, and it was part of this that was etched off, and this both explains how it could be carved by the dwarves, and why its light was duller than that of a Silmaril. The other argument is that the Silmarils would injure and painfully burn anyone or anything that touched them that had evil characteristics. It would seem odd how Smaug, who was undoubtedly an evil creature, managed to sleep on the Arkenstone if it had this quality, cause it would surely burn him and cause him tremendous pain. However, again for this, there's a counter-argument. that the Arkenstone could have been at the bottom of his gold pile and thus never made contact with him. Also, it's heavily implied that mortal flesh would also be injured from holding a Silmaril, which would again suggest that the Arkenstone wasn't one, since the dwarfs, Bilbo and Bard, handled it freely and without injury. I think that despite all these theories, we can safely say that it wasn't a Silmaril. My favorite belief is that it could have been one of the other gems that Feanor had made, but it's only based on speculation. What I think we can be quite sure of though, is that the Arkenstone and the Silmarils share a common inspiration. In the History of Middle-earth, Volume 4, we learn that in the Old English version, the Silmarils are called Arkenstanas, which does sound similar to Arkenstone. Finally, we're told, and they knew that those jewels could not be found or brought together again unless the world be broken and remade. This seems to directly say that the Silmarils would only be found and recovered after Dagor Dagorath, the apocalypse of Middle-earth, and therefore does shoot down the theory of the Arkenstone being a lost Silmaril. There are two last points that I'd like to make. Firstly, that it used to bother me a bit that after all the dwarfs lost and went through, that the heirloom and prize of their kingdom was buried with Thorin. I always used to wish that it was embedded above the throne of Erebor, forever to be a testament to the pride, ferocity, fervor and perseverance of the dwarfs, that after losing so many of their homes, they would keep getting back up to reclaim them as the furnace of their spirit burnt hot. And yet as I grew older, I started to understand it a bit better, that perhaps since it was such a driving force behind Thorin's greed, isn't it symbolic that it also was buried with him? A symbolic change in the Dwarven people, that perhaps they were moving forward past their greed. My second point is again my own speculation. In the books we're told that when Thorin was buried with his sword or crest, it would gleam in the dark when foes approached, and thus the dwarves of Erebor would never be caught or taken by surprise. I'd like to think that the light Orcrist gave off would pass through the Arkenstone and thus give off an even brighter, more dazzling light, though this is just a fun thought I had. Anyway, this wraps up the video and I'm curious to know what you guys think about it all. If you can, leave a like, cause it helps this channel greatly, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we can once again explore the wonderful world and lore of Middle-earth.